My best friend laughed first. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not my husband's sharp intake of breath. Not the sound of his chair scraping against the tile floor as he stood up too fast. It was her laugh, low, almost relieved, that I heard through the partially open door of our hotel suite in Kyoto before I knocked. Before I walked in. Before everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be architecture built on sand. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I have to take you back to the beginning. Because the beginning matters. It always does. My husband and I met in our late 20s at a charity auction, the kind of event where everyone is dressed slightly too formally and the wine is slightly too warm. He was a real estate attorney at a firm downtown. I was 2 years into building my own interior design business from a studio apartment with a second-hand desk and more ambition than sense. He bid on a landscape painting that I also wanted. He won. He found me afterward and offered to let me borrow it. I told him I didn't borrow things I couldn't return. He said he'd figure something out. 3 months later, he proposed with the painting hung behind him on the wall of the restaurant where we had our first real date. I know how that sounds now. We built a life together that looked, from the outside, exactly the way you'd want a life to look. We bought a house in a neighborhood with good schools even though we didn't have children yet. We went to dinner parties and hosted our own. We talked about the future in the easy, confident way of people who believe the future will cooperate. My business grew steadily. His practice expanded. We were, by every visible measure, doing fine. My best friend had been part of my life since we were 9 years old, sitting next to each other in 4th grade because the teacher arranged desks alphabetically and our last names were 2 letters apart. We had survived high school together, college in different cities with weekly phone calls, bad relationships, good ones, career setbacks, family losses. She was the maid of honor at my wedding. She gave a speech that made everyone in the room cry. When I asked her afterward what she'd said because I couldn't stop shaking long enough to hear it properly, she told me, "I said that the best thing about watching you find him was knowing you'd never have to be found by the wrong one again." I quoted that to myself for years. I thought it was the most loving thing anyone had ever said about my marriage. By the time I turned 38, my business had grown to a point where I had a small team, 4 designers, an office manager, a part-time bookkeeper. I handled the major client relationships and the creative direction. My husband handled our personal finances, our investment accounts, our joint savings. This was, at the time, an arrangement that made sense. He was a financial attorney. He understood numbers in a way I found useful but not particularly interesting. I trusted him completely. That last sentence is not an excuse. It is simply a fact I am placing here so you understand the architecture of how this fell apart. The Kyoto trip was his idea. Our 10th anniversary was coming up, and he suggested Japan because I had mentioned it once in passing, years ago, as a place I wanted to see before I got too old to want to walk a lot. The fact that he remembered surprised me. It shouldn't have, I suppose, but by then small gestures of attentiveness had started to feel surprising rather than ordinary. I noticed that and filed it away under things to think about later. I never got to later. We arrived in mid-October, which is the right time to be in Kyoto. The maples were just beginning to turn. Our hotel was a traditional ryokan in the Higashiyama district, the kind of place with paper screens and stone gardens and the particular silence that comes from architecture designed around quiet. I remember thinking, as we walked to our room, that this was going to be good. That we needed this. That whatever small distances had been accumulating between us over the past year might close here, in a place this beautiful. The first 3 days were almost exactly what I'd hoped for. We walked through Fushimi Inari at sunrise before the crowds arrived. We ate at small counter restaurants where the chef prepared everything in front of us and we couldn't read the menu and just pointed at whatever the person next to us was having. My husband bought me a small ceramic bowl from a shop in Nishiki Market, wrapped in tissue paper, tucked into a cotton bag. I carried it through the rest of the city in my purse like it was something precious. Maybe I was trying harder than usual. Maybe he was too. I wasn't asking those questions yet. On the 4th day, he had a call he couldn't reschedule. This happened sometimes. His clients operated across time zones, and a deal he was closing back home had moved up its timeline. He apologized over breakfast, told me to spend the morning without him, said he'd meet me for lunch at a restaurant we'd booked near Arashiyama. I wasn't bothered. I'm comfortable in my own company. I had a list of textile shops I wanted to visit anyway. The kind of errand a solo traveler does better without someone waiting impatiently outside. I spent the morning well, I found a fabric atelier run by a woman in her 70s who let me sit with her for an hour while she explained the dyeing process she'd learned from her grandmother. I bought 2 small bolts of indigo linen that I knew I'd use on a project eventually. I had green tea in a garden. I was happy in the specific, uncomplicated way that only happens when you are somewhere beautiful and briefly free of everything you're responsible for. I got back to our room around 11 to drop off my purchases before heading to meet him. My phone buzzed on the nightstand where I'd left it charging. Then buzzed again. I had set up account alerts on our joint checking account years ago, back when we were tighter with money, and never turned them off. 2 withdrawals had come through that morning. The first was a wire transfer I didn't recognize, not the amount, not the recipient name, not the account number it went to. $42,000. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I want to be precise about what happened in me in that moment, because I've spent a lot of time since then trying to understand it. It wasn't panic. It wasn't immediate rage. It was something closer to the feeling you get when you're reading a sentence and you realize halfway through that you've misunderstood the beginning, and now you have to go back to the start and read the whole thing again differently. A quiet, vertiginous recalibration. I opened my laptop. I am an organized person by profession. When your work involves managing large projects with many variables and clients who change their minds and contractors who run late, you develop systems. I have folders. I have records. I know where things are. My husband managed our finances, but I had read-only access to our accounts, something I'd insisted on years ago, not out of distrust but out of the belief that both people in a marriage should know what's in their bank accounts. It took me 20 minutes to find what I was looking for, and another 40 to understand it fully. There had been 12 transfers over the past 19 months, not always large, sometimes 3,000, once 8, twice over 20. They went to 3 different accounts. 2 of them I traced quickly to real estate transactions, a title company, a closing cost payment. The 3rd account I couldn't immediately identify, but the pattern of deposits mapped precisely onto a property purchase timeline. Something had been bought. Something significant. I pulled up the property records database I use for work designers, access it for renovation histories and permit records, and searched the address I found in a PDF buried in a cloud folder my husband had labeled, with remarkable audacity, Investment Planning 2023. The property was a 2-bedroom condominium in a renovated building about 4 miles from our house. It had closed escrow 14 months ago. The listed owner was a Holdings LLC with a name I didn't recognize. The registered agent of that LLC was my husband's law firm. I sat back from the laptop. The room was very quiet. Through the paper screen, I could see the shadow of the garden outside, a pine branch moving slightly in a wind I couldn't hear. I thought about the ceramic bowl in my purse. I thought about the speech my best friend had given at my wedding. I thought about $42,000 wired that morning while my husband was supposedly on a call with a client. Then I thought about something else. 2 months ago, my best friend had told me she was moving. She'd been renting an apartment across town for years, and she said she'd finally found something better. A nicer neighborhood, more space. She was excited about it. I had helped her pack 3 boxes of books. I had brought her a plant as a housewarming gift. She had given me the new address. I had put it in my phone. I opened my contacts. The address she'd given me was the same building. I'm not going to tell you that I felt nothing, because that would be false. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from realizing that 2 betrayals have been happening simultaneously, layered on top of each other like transparencies, and that every interaction you've had with both people during that time has been a performance staged for your benefit. It's not just grief. It's a retrospective rewriting of memory. Every phone call with my best friend over the past year and a half. Every dinner where she'd asked how things were going with my husband, and I'd said fine, good, a little distant but fine, and she had nodded with her chin in her hand and said she was sure it was just work stress. Every time I'd felt lonely in my marriage and called her about it. She knew. She was the reason. I sat in that room for a long time. Long enough that I missed lunch. My husband texted twice, first to ask where I was, then to say he was heading back to the hotel. I texted back that I wasn't feeling well, that I'd stayed in to rest, that he should enjoy the afternoon without me. He sent a heart emoji. I stared at it for a moment, and then put my phone face down on the bed. There are 2 ways to respond to a moment like that one. The first is to walk into the wreckage, immediately confront, accuse, collapse into the thing that's happening. The second is to take a breath and think about what you actually want the outcome to be. I am a designer. I spend my professional life thinking about outcomes before I touch anything. I closed my laptop. I ordered room service. I ate it calmly. And then I called my attorney back home. She is very good at her job. I found her 3 years ago when a client dispute threatened to become a lawsuit, and she had navigated it so efficiently that I'd never had to think about it again. I had her cell number because she'd told me to use it if something ever felt urgent. She picked up on the second ring. I explained what I'd found. I gave her the account numbers, the property address, the LLC name. She was quiet while I talked. When I finished, she said, "I need you to not confront anyone and not move any money until I've had 24 hours to look at this." I said I understood. She said, "You're in Japan right now." I said yes. She said, "Okay. Go to dinner. Act normal. I'll call you tomorrow morning your time." Acting normal, it turns out, is one of the harder things I have ever done. My husband came back to the room in the late afternoon. He sat on the bed beside me and put his hand on my forehead. I told him I felt unwell and asked if I needed anything. I said I just needed rest. He said he'd gone back to Arashiyama alone and walked through the bamboo grove and it was incredible, and he wished I'd been there. I said maybe we could go back tomorrow. He said yes, absolutely. We had 2 days left. He looked so normal. That's what I couldn't stop noticing. He looked exactly like my husband. He said exactly the things my husband would say. And I lay there in that quiet room in Kyoto listening to him talk about bamboo groves, looking at the face I had woken up next to for 10 years, and I understood something I don't think I'd understood before, that you can know someone for a decade and still be meeting a stranger. We had dinner that night at a small restaurant he'd researched. He ordered for both of us because the menu was in Japanese and he'd photographed it earlier and run it through a translation app. He was thoughtful like that, efficient and prepared. I had liked that about him once. I ate my dinner. I asked him questions about his day. I laughed at something he said. I was, if I'm being honest, the better actor of the two of us. Because at least I knew I was acting. That night, while he slept, I went through everything one more time on my phone. I documented what I could. I forwarded the bank alerts to my attorney. I found 3 photographs on my husband's cloud account. We had shared photo storage, something we'd set up lazily years ago that I hadn't noticed before. They were taken inside a condominium that looked like the building in the property records. One of them included a reflection in a window. The reflection showed 2 people. I recognized them both. My attorney called me at 7 the next morning. "The LLC is his," she said. "He's the beneficial owner through a chain that was clearly designed to obscure it, but it's sloppy work. He's a real estate attorney, not a corporate attorney, and he didn't structure it as carefully as he should have. The property was purchased using funds from your joint account. That makes it a marital asset regardless of how it's titled. I've already pulled the records." She told me what she needed me to do. I wrote it down. Then I asked the question I needed to ask. "What about her?" I said. "My best friend. Is she liable for anything?" There was a brief pause. "Potentially. If she knowingly received marital assets, there are options. But let's focus on securing your position first." After we hung up, I sat by the window and watched the Kyoto morning happen outside delivery trucks. A woman in an apron sweeping the stone path in front of the building across the street. 2 schoolchildren walking in the same direction with identical backpacks. Ordinary life, completely indifferent to mine. I had 2 days left of this trip. I decided to use them. I went back to the textile shop and bought another bolt of fabric. I visited a museum I hadn't made time for. I had matcha ice cream while sitting on a stone step, watching tourists photograph a temple gate. When my husband and I were together, I was present enough to seem present. I asked about his work. I told him about things I'd seen. We went to the bamboo grove, as I'd suggested, and it was exactly as extraordinary as he'd said, and I walked through it thinking about marital asset division. On our last evening, we went to the restaurant we'd booked months ago for our anniversary dinner, proper a kaiseki place with a 6-course menu and a view over a small garden lit with soft lanterns. My husband had ordered a bottle of champagne in advance. It was waiting for us at the table, already open. He gave me a card. Inside, he had written about 10 years, about the life we'd made, about wanting the next 10 to be even better. I read every word. Then I reached into my bag and placed on the table the envelope my attorney had overnighted to the hotel. She is efficient, as I said, with a local courier completing the final leg that afternoon. It was a thick envelope, cream-colored, with my name in the return address corner. "What's this?" he said. "That's from my attorney," I said. "The champagne is good, by the way." I watched him open it. I watched his face change in real time, the sequence of expressions cycling through confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been relief if I'd been watching less carefully. He set the papers down on the table. He looked at me. "How long have you known?" he said. "Long enough," I said. "I'd like to finish dinner." We finished dinner. He didn't speak much. I ate everything that came out of that kitchen because it was extraordinary. And I had not come this far to waste a 6-course kaiseki meal over a man who had been embezzling from our joint account for 19 months to fund an apartment for my best friend. On the flight home, we sat in the same row because I hadn't changed the tickets. There wasn't much to say. He tried. Once, somewhere over the Pacific. He said he had meant to tell me. He said it had gotten out of hand. He said things that I think he believed were explanations but were, in the end, just the sounds a person makes when they've been caught and don't have a better option than words. I put in my earbuds and watched 3 movies. What happened after is less dramatic than the 10 days that preceded it. But I'm going to tell you anyway because I know what you're wondering. Because the comments on every story like mine ask the same question, and they deserve a real answer. What happened to them? My attorney was, as I said, very good. The condo had been purchased with over $90,000 in marital funds across those 19 months. Under our state's laws, that was marital property regardless of how it had been titled, and my husband knew that he was a real estate attorney, after all. The irony was not lost on either of us. In the divorce settlement, I received the house, my business assets in full, my retirement account, and a cash settlement that effectively compensated me for the funds diverted to the property purchase. He got considerably less than he'd expected to get. The condo became the subject of a separate legal action. Since he couldn't demonstrate the funds were separate property because they weren't, the LLC was dissolved, and the asset was folded into the marital estate. My best friend, who had been living in a 2-bedroom condominium she believed was hers, received a legal notice that the property was subject to divorce proceedings and that her occupancy arrangement had no legal standing. She had never been on any paperwork. He had kept her name off everything, likely for exactly the reason it now mattered. He'd had no legitimate way to give it to her. She called me the day she got that notice. She called from the number I'd had for her since we were 19 years old. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message. I listened to it once. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't planned for it to happen. She said she hoped eventually I might understand. I didn't call back. I deleted the voicemail. I kept the plant I'd bought her as a housewarming gift in my memory as the single most absurd image I have to carry from this entire experience, me standing in the lobby of that building with a potted succulent, congratulating her on her new place. My husband relocated to a rental across town. He tried to negotiate better terms 3 times over the following 5 months. Each time my attorney replied calmly and without movement. He stopped trying after that. The firm he worked for let him go 8 months after the divorce proceedings began. A real estate attorney whose financial misconduct was now a matter of public record was not, it turned out, an asset they wanted to retain. My best friend left the city eventually. Mutual friends have mentioned her in passing, and I've listened politely and changed the subject. I don't know where she went and I haven't asked. Here is what I want to say, and I want to say it carefully because I've thought about this more than anything else in the past 2 years. I was not naive. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a tendency, when a woman is deceived like this, to frame her as someone who should have known better, should have been watching more closely, should have been less trusting. I was not naive. I was trusting in the way that you are supposed to trust a partner you have built something real with over 10 years. I was trusting in the way that you are supposed to trust someone who gave a speech at your wedding about what it means to be truly found by the right person. That trust was not a flaw. It was a reasonable thing that turned out to be misplaced. The misplacement was their failure, not mine. What I did, the sitting in a hotel room in Kyoto and eating my dinner and calling my attorney and walking through the bamboo grove and flying home and letting the legal process do what the legal process is built to do, that was not coldness. People have called it that when I've told parts of this story to people who know me. But it wasn't coldness. It was clarity. And clarity, when everything around you has turned out to be something other than what it appeared, is not a luxury. It's survival. I kept my business. I kept my house. I kept the small ceramic bowl he'd bought me in Nishiki Market. Because he paid for it with our joint credit card and I decided it was mine, and it sits on my desk now, and I find that I don't think about where it came from very much anymore. I kept the indigo linen, too. I eventually used it on a project, a sitting room for a client in a 19th century brownstone on the north side of the city, pale walls, dark wood, the fabric made into curtains that filter the afternoon light into something almost blue. The client said it was exactly right. Some things are. Some things, even after everything, are exactly right. My 4th grade teacher used to say that the truth has a way of organizing itself whether you help it along or not. I don't know that I entirely believed that when I was 9. I believe it now. My former best friend gave a speech at my wedding about being found by the right person. I thought, for a long time, that she was talking about my husband. I think what she was actually describing, without knowing it, was what the next years would teach me to do for myself. To look at a situation clearly. To know what something is worth. To understand when something has been built on a foundation that was wrong from the start, and to decide quietly, thoroughly, without drama to build it again on ground that will hold. I am still building. And the ground, these days, is solid.